Hopefully. Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks for coming. So I want to begin this with a little audience participation. So we have 3 pairs of sentences. One of them is an MT system. One of them is actually, sadly, a reference, human reference sentence for one of the MT evals. So those of you who participated in MT eval for a really long time don't talk about which one it is. But those of you who don't know, guess. Which one is the person, which one is the machine? And tell me. Oh, and also for the rest of this talk, feel free to just interrupt whenever and ask questions. Just have a dialogue. So which is MT and which one is written by a person who learned English as a second language? Yes? The second is MT and the first is person. Okay, anybody else want to offer a different opinion? Opposite. Okay, so it's not that easy to tell, is it? So I'll give you a hint. They're tracked. So if you think the first one is the person, then it's the same entity for all 3 sentences. Because I think the very first pair of sentences are probably harder to tell, but the second and third pairs, I think, are easier to tell.
I think for machines, it's easier to guarantee that grammar is correct.
You think for a machine it's easier to guarantee the grammar is correct? Actually, I think it's hard for both. I mean, basically systems and humans make grammar mistakes always, or not always, but they all make grammar mistakes. But maybe they make some similar ones and some different ones. And I was curious to see if any of you might have spotted something particular that you think is the telltale sign of a machine, or the telltale sign of a person. Now, I should give you another hint, because this came up at some point in a previous audience. The system is a fairly standard phrase-based MT system, statistical MT system. So, you know, it's not like a syntax-based MT, for example. So you might not expect it to be that good at grammar, for example. Right? You can imagine there's some MT system that pays more attention to kind of syntactic construction. Maybe they'd be a little bit more grammatical. But this is just your Moses souped up, maybe. I'm not actually sure which system it is. Maybe it's the Google system. I done this slide a while ago, so I don't remember which MT system in particular, but I'm pretty sure it was a phrase-based static MT system. So, first or second? How many people think the first one is the human? Okay, why?
So if you look at the second pair, the person doesn't have any subjective in it. So if it's a person, then maybe this person is totally unaware of this, that English has a subjective. The second is almost right. So I think the machine translation system would at least know something about subjectives. So probably the second is machine translation. But then in the third tier, the first one has really bad grammar. That's no human would write it that way. So I'm going to take the first one.
Okay, so the answer is the first one is the machine. Probably the easiest one to tell is the third pair of sentence. But the interesting thing about this is several. Okay, so one, it's not that obvious if I don't point things out. 2, they make some of the mistakes they make are very similar. And 3, some of the mistakes they make are very, very different. Right? So even in the third sentence, the one that you think is really bad, arguably there are places where the machine did a lot better. In order to rekindle the hope, that's a really, really high, fluent, proficient English speaker usage, as opposed to, you know, lit the hope, which you kind of know what they mean, but it's not something you would say. And so that's how you can tell. Rekindle the hope, language model, right? N-gram language model, it's going to give you rekindle the hope. But if you don't know the word, then you don't get anything. The dawn of the playoff, I mean, whatever. So it actually really depends. The things that we also saw was that the human sentences are wrong, but wrong in a way that's recoverable. Like usually they're kind of weird, subtle semantic problems that you could see, and like using wound instead of injury, right? So wound, injury, it's a synonym, but they have slightly different connotations. You wouldn't use wound for something that the basketball player experiences. So you know that the humans get kind of the general idea, they just make semantic choices wrong. Whereas MT, well, if you're on track and you have all of the words, phrases in your phrase table, and you've done the right thing, you used a good language model, and there's not really any problem, you come out with really good sounding sentences. Okay, you probably don't know about subjunctive and things like that unless you are again, a syntax-aware MT system. But even with a phrase-based one, you can kind of make it work a lot of times. But if you're wrong, boy, you're just way wrong. So that's kind of the observations that we make. The part that I found interesting was that, well, sometimes they seem kind of similar. So the question is, can we do something about that? Are there some sort of overlapping points for these two communities that traditionally have not had a whole lot to say to each other? So I think you guys are probably fairly familiar with MT, so I'm going to instead spend more time covering the background on grammar error correction. Typically in this talk for English as a second language, but it's really for any language as a second language or third language. But what people typically do, and again, English being the one that people study a lot, there's been a lot more resources and a lot more previous work on this. Typically, you would think of this as your Word. For example, if you use Microsoft Word, you write a sentence that's not fully fluent, you'll see a little green squiggle line telling you that maybe you want to rephrase it. And the way they do it is they basically check against specific categories of error, such as determiners. This is one that I'm personally particularly bad at, being a non-native English speaker. Prepositions, mass countdown is the one that I absolutely hate, and verb form misuses, tense, and stuff like that. In contrast, you might take a completely different approach of just trying to rewrite the sentence entirely to make it sound more fluent. And that, in some ways, has some parallels with either paraphrasing or with MT. You can see that most of the work is kind of done on the first category, and there are a few work in the second category, but not a lot. So what we're interested in is this overall question. To what extent does MT and grammar error correction inform each other? Does knowing something about making ESL writing more fluent tell us how to make MT sentences more fluent? Or conversely, can we just think about ESL English as yet another kind of source language for which we're going to just translate into whatever standard American English is? So that's the question. This is, I might as well give you the punchline right now. I'm not going to be able to answer this today. We started working on this, we have some initial results, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Specifically, I'll be going over two applications. One is called error correction detection, where we're trying to identify common grammar errors and then determine the cause for them. And we want to be able to do this for both ESL students and for MT systems. A second task is redundant phrase detection. So if you have a sentence that's wordy or has a lot of extraneous words in it, we would like to be able to delete those. You can think about the first one as largely trying to tackle the problem of how does grammar error correction inform MT, and the second one as more of how does MT inform grammar error correction. But as with all things, they bleed into each other in some ways, and I'll end with some ongoing work that we're still currently doing. Okay, so error correction detection is this following problem. Given a problematic sentence written probably by a non-native speaker, and a corrected version, either corrected by a teacher or maybe the student, they corrected it themselves, but somehow you have this pair of sentences, one wrong, one right. Find all of the places where the mistakes were made and identify what was the mistake for each case. Okay, so That's basically grammar, that's basically error correction detection. This is a particular application, perhaps different than what you might be used to, which is kind of the more usual prediction style grammar error correction task, which says, give me a sentence and I'll tell you if it's got mistake in it. This is slightly different. This says, I give you two sentences, one wrong, one right. Find where and tell me more about what mistakes there are. Why do we care about that? Well, for ESL students, this is good for tutoring. So an automatic tutoring system would need something like this because it cuts down on the work of the amount of feedback that the tutor would have to provide for the student. It's also nice for a more peer setting where you can pair up, for example, this is popular, I know, for example, Lang8, a online forum where you can pair up people studying languages in different languages. So I could be a native Chinese speaker learning English, and I could be paired up with a native English speaker learning Chinese. So in that case, I know what Chinese is supposed to sound like, they know what English is supposed to sound like, but maybe we're not so fluent in pedagogical terms for why things are wrong, in which case, all I can say is, well, no, it doesn't sound good, so you should rewrite it this way. You know, you don't want the peer tutor to try to come up with reasons, and they can just easily write down whatever they think sounds good and let the system take care of supplying the reasons. So essentially, this is good for some sort of error analysis. And so you can do error analysis by directly giving feedback to a person, a student who's learning a different language, or you might think about it as giving feedback to a system developer, an MT system developer, for example, who might like to have, one, a different form of MT evaluation. Two, maybe this more detailed error analysis could offer ideas on how to improve the model, where to spend the time, where not to spend the time. And three, potentially, if everything works great, then we might be able to gain insights into learning how to generate more fluent sentences on that. So that's kind of why we're interested in this task. But how hard is this problem? Well, it kind of depends. It depends on what kind of data resources you might have. So if you're developing a system like this for an ESL setting, it depends on whether you have access to some sort of systematic corrections, what we will be calling a learner's corpora, which is basically collections of essays or sentences written by ESL speakers and then passed over by an English teacher or two and corrected according to some scheme of error categories. Depending on how detailed these categories are, the problem may be easier or harder. Depending on whether you look at overlapping problems and problems that interact with each other, the problem could be easier or harder. For today's talk, we'll be only looking at non-overlapping cases. That's typically what people analyze currently. Our technology is not quite ready for looking at very complex interleaving errors. And finally, it depends on the student's proficiency. Naturally, the problem is actually much harder if the student's proficiency is very high, because pretty much you're not going to find very big mistakes. It's going to be hard to tell. But if the student is a first-year student learning language, kind of a first-year language course, then they kind of make the sort of mistakes that are fairly recognizable, and you can capture that. Now, if I wanted to adapt it for the MT domain, we have additional issues. For one, we don't really have that kind of resources. I mean, if we didn't have it for the ESL case, we really don't have it for the MT case. You might have MT sentences compared against references, or you might have MT sentences compared against human-edited translation based on that MT sentence to correct the error, but you're not going to have your detailed mapping and some sort of taxonomy of the error types. And so that's why we were thinking about adapting this from the ESL domain, but that might create other problems in that, well, one, the automatic system might not be robust enough, and two, there might just be mismatches between the sort of MT errors that you see and the sort of errors that ESL students make. And so we don't know necessarily if this adaptation would work out. Nonetheless, we began our exploration by trying to make sure that we have a strong A predictor of error corrections as possible. And so we started with a recent work, one example that we found in the literature, where somebody did develop a system that precisely tried to compare a pair of sentences, find all of the mistakes, and then give it a category. For their problem, they specifically looked at an annotated learners corpus called the Cambridge FCE corpus. That's the first certificate exam corpus. Apparently, it's some sort of an upper intermediate level English proficiency. It's an exam given to ensure that students who pass it have kind of like everyday usage of English good enough for work and studies. So that's kind of the level of student quality we're talking about. And on this system, the nice thing about this corpus is that somebody had already designed a annotation scheme, has a collection of error categories, and it's actually fairly detailed. There are 75 of them, so it's a lot. And on this particular framework, Swanson and Yamago's system performed about an overall 58% F-score on identifying and classifying these errors. And the approach they took is fairly straightforward. They start off saying, well, we're going to compare using minimum edit distance to find where things change, individual changes, insertions, deletions, etc. And then we are going to merge things that are next to each other into what we call an error, and then we are going to classify them. So since 58 seems pretty low, we wanted to know what was the problem? Why was it not that good? And we thought, well, if you really look at it, right, if the problem is in minimum edit distance, extracting the wrong primitive pairs, maybe we want to do some sort of a different alignment out there, for example. The problem occurs because pretty much you just wanted to minimize the cost of changes. So there's not any guarantee that the change that the system decided to make is necessarily going to make linguistic choices. In this illustration, both examples, I think, give you the same score, even though the one on the right is probably the one that we as people prefer. So that's basically the potential source of error from minimum edit distance. And then the second problem is this ambiguity in terms of merging decisions. Things could have gap between them and still be about the same grammar error, or things could be right next to each other but are two separate problems. So if you simply say, well, if they're next to each other, we're just going to always form the bigger blob, you might get it wrong. And if you get it wrong by trying to decide what makes an entity of error correction, then you're not going to be able to make the correct classification downstream. So by the time we get to this classification, maybe it's already too late. Or maybe that the first two steps are all fine, and it's that you need a better classifier. So we did a little error analysis, and it turned out that it was mostly an emerging decision, which was actually a little disappointing, to tell you the truth, because originally we were thinking about treating this as a case of MT informing grammar error correction. We were going to run like your standard phrase-based extraction to see what happens. But since minimum error distance seems to do okay, we focused on trying to address the merging decision problem. And we didn't do anything too fancy. Essentially, we decided that it's just a binary decision. Either merge or you don't merge, and whether you merge or not depends on the context of the mistake. So we can basically extract features from every pair of isolated primitive edits and then make a decision for whether we should merge them or not. And this is an example of how a sentence can, from one sentence pair, you can extract many training examples of both positives and negatives for the merging. The patterns themselves are also fairly straightforward. Here are some examples of features that we used. Things like whether there's a gap between the edits or not, whether there's a tense change if you're looking at verbs, if it might be a word order error, then you might want to merge them. But if it's maybe having a very small edit distance, same part of speech tag, maybe you don't want to. So there are basically a bunch of patterns that we've observed contextually. And as a result of doing this modification, we can reduce the merging error rate from 22% to 8%. And that improves the overall F-score from 58% to 66%. So I don't know if 66% is necessarily good enough for applying it then to MT systems on a totally different corpus, but it's a start, so that's kind of where we begin. Okay, so in order to adapt it to the MT scenario, there are a couple of things that we need to address. One is that, well, for MT cases, I don't know if necessarily you want 75 very fine-tuned categories in terms of ESL student errors. These categories do tend to focus on fluency and grammar errors rather than translation adequacies. So maybe that's going to come into play in some way. We don't have the corpus, I've mentioned that earlier, so we'll have to do some sort of manual annotation in order to get started. And then finally, since our detection system is trained on this ESL corpus, we're worried about the adaptation effect. So for each one of these, we did the following. First, we just reduced the number of categories. Instead of the very fine-grained 75 categories, we ended up using 6 major ESL categories that made sense for an MT setting that was used in the UIUC ESL corpus. It's a much smaller corpus, annotated corpus, but it's mapped to these 6 categories. And the nice thing about that is that the people who prepared the work, Rozovskaya and Roth, they have also done studies on the users. So we also know what this ESL student's error distribution is like for each one of these cases. Now, we then manually annotated a small set of MT sentences using an MT system and reference sentences for evaluation. And then finally, instead of just saying, well, we're just necessarily going to use the classifier, we've also developed an alternative correction system. It was a handwritten rule-based system that a student developed specifically for MT. Just so that you have a sense, here are the sort of categories, these 6 broad categories, what they look like. So we're looking at article errors, preposition errors, numbers, verbs, and probably most of the time word replacement errors where you've made some sort of lexical choice mistake. So the system is fairly straightforward. You compare the reference against the hypothesis MT system. We use meteor as the word alignment. And this is in a way nicer than the minimum edit distance because you can now capture some of the synonyms, etc. And so it's possibly more suited for the MT scenario. So that was one of the changes we've made. And then after the alignment, we look for errors by looking for patterns and then assigning them using POS tags and so forth. And then after we were done, we extract the statistics and then have kind of this profile of how an MT system performed in terms of the sort of mistakes that they made. So now that we have all of the pieces, we decided to run some experiments. One of our hypotheses is that we can do this more detailed style error analysis for MT. So we're going to try both the rule-based system and the classifier system on some MT data. And you'll see a check mark. That means that I'm going to argue that we've succeeded in doing that. The second hypothesis, the one that I was hoping to see, was that doing this error analysis would allow us to make some sort of observation about how MT behaves and how ESL students behaved. Specifically, in the Rozovskaya and Roth study, they've shown that students from different places with different first language have very different error patterns because, say, if you're Chinese, you don't have articles, you don't have tenses, and you make more tense and article mistakes, whereas if you're French, maybe you make different kinds of mistakes. And so we were hoping to see that this is also true for MT systems. We wanted to see whether if you are a German English MT system, maybe you make different kinds of mistakes than if you were a Czech MT system. And we also wanted to see whether it's true that maybe if you're a high-performing MT system, you're more like a person, and if you're a low-performing MT system, maybe you would be a little bit worse. You'll notice by the lack of a check mark, we basically cannot show that. So we have two hypotheses. One of them, I'm going to argue that we've made it, and the other one, pretty much, might have to be taken. Okay? This is to show things don't always work out the way we wanted it to. All right, so experiment one was for just looking at the domain effect on correction and detection. So we have here two data sets. One of them I talked about, the FCE data set. For evaluation, we've extracted 100 reference sentences from the German English test set from the WMT 2012 workshop. And we manually compared those 100 sentences against a high-performance MT German English system as well as a low-performance MT system, and then label all of the corrections by type according to the 6 major types that you saw. So that was the data set, and then this is the outcome. So we ran both systems on both data set, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the FCE trained classifier works better on the FCE data set, and the rule-based system that's designed after the MT data works better for the MT system, the MT data set. Actually, the rule-based system does very well for the MT data, given the way that it was annotated. Probably it has more to do with that. The annotation considers more cases of individual word corrections. So a lot of the mistakes are word replacement errors or making the wrong choices on the word level, whereas the classifier, the trained classifier, as we've talked about, spend a lot of time trying to figure out when to merge. So it does prefer to merge a lot of the cases, and so it prefers to see things as a phrase translated into another phrase. And that is why, even though precision is pretty good, the recall is fairly low. And so at this current time, we can't really use the classifier for the MT data. I still think that there are ways to adapt it better, so that's something for us to see in the future. But in the meantime, the rule-based system gives us this reasonably robust score of 82 for the MT data, so we're going to be happy to use the rule-based system from this point on for the rest of our analysis. Just in case you were wondering, here's a breakdown of the specific error types. You'll see that it does better for certain errors than others. The other interesting thing is also that the detector works better for low-quality MT system than for high-quality MT system. And so that's not really a surprise because high-quality MT systems are harder to detect the problems of, whereas low-quality MT system makes probably more systematic mistakes that you can catch. The rule-based system is not very good at detecting verb form errors, but happily for us, it doesn't happen very often. So most of the error, unfortunately, for our next experiment, happens to be word replacement error. And that's basically the limiting factor for why we couldn't compare very well between the MT system and the ESL fluent students. So in the second study, I will quickly talk about, the ESL data was done by somebody else, as I mentioned before. They showed that students from different regions had different error profiles. We performed studies using both a high-performing system, low-performing system for 4 pairs of languages, German, Czech, Spanish, and French. So the data sets themselves are actually different because, of course, the MT system was done on the shared task, while the human data was somewhere else. So it's not exactly comparable, but you can kind of get a sense for it. We look at errors per 100 words so that it makes these two corpora a little bit more comparable. And unsurprisingly, right, systems MT systems generally make a lot more errors than ESL students do. And you can also see that systems like French English performs a lot better than, say, Czech English, which is probably what we expected. Overall numbers look reasonably low, but if you look at specifically how source language influenced the overall numbers of errors, there, unfortunately, we did not see a strong difference in terms of error distributions. So a high-performing MT may overall make fewer mistakes than a low-performing MT, but the type of mistakes that they make in terms of error distributions come out to be fairly similar. And the bulk of it tends to be word replacement errors, meaning that sometimes you just don't find the right word, and that's going to be the problem. We thought about, well, what if we take a look at something more specific, like, say, article mistakes? Because it's still a fairly sizable number of errors, but it factors out the word replacement problem. So we did that, and we just looked more deeply into the sort of article mistakes in detail, like missing the or inserting extra things like that. And pretty much, actually, the high and low performing MT systems still are very similar to each other. So this changes our original theory that, oh, well, maybe they're similar because the bulk of it was just because they made word replacement error. Because here now, we're looking only at article errors, and they're still fairly similar. So our final hypothesis is that, well, pretty much, even though they're different systems, different language pairs, they all use the same English language model. And probably that's why everything is so similar. Because after everything else, when you come down to it, you prefer what the trigram and RAM model tells you. So that's our current hypothesis. Another possibility is that maybe we needed to tune our annotation scheme differently in order to highlight some of the error types. So that remains for us an ongoing work. So far we've seen that our MT systems in this set have very similar distributions, regardless of their source languages and regardless of error types. But that we also note encouragingly that many MT systems do make mistakes that fall into one of the ESL categories. So potentially, even though we can't say, well, use this to see how close they are to a human, we can use this in some way to improve MT modeling in some way, or possibly improving generating more fluent sentences. For example, we can say, well, we can detect a lot of the preposition errors, then we can use the standard technique from the grammar error correction community to substitute and make generate the outcome more fluent. Okay? So I'm about to switch sections, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If not, go on. Yes?
When you call rules, it seems more like category assignment. I mean, if you look at the English article, there might be like 50 or 70 rules. So have you thought about actually looking at more detailed rules?
Right.
Is that sort of outside the scope of what you're trying to do?
So I think that is outside of the scope of what we're trying to do in the sense that I actually wanted to go exactly the opposite direction where I wanted fewer rules. But I think that's why I wanted to be able to adapt better, because I think pretty much you want to automatically pick up these patterns through training in some way. And so the way to incorporate more fine-grained patterns like that, I think, is by looking at the, for example, the FCE corpus and do a lot of the pattern learning automatically through a learned classifier or some sort, rather than having this particular student designing patterns herself, which I think is harder for them. So good question. So I think definitely we would like to be more specific, but I think we wanted to be more specific in a more obvious ways. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, I was going to listen to the end of the
Yeah.
presentation. So you mentioned, particularly here, the fact that the high performing and low performing really don't differ, in any fundamental way. And the hypothesis is so tied directly to an n-grammatical model that's so dominant in these types of key systems.
Right.
So I know you don't have any evidence, but do you conjecture actually that if you look at kind of the syntax-based or other more sophisticated frameworks that we do in T nowadays, where the surface n-grammatical probably has less than other things would play,
Right.
the behavior would actually move something.
That's my hope, actually. So what I hope to do is to be able to find a more varied population of MT systems. And I think I would see more difference, although I don't know if necessarily I would see a clear correlation between the distribution profile of each system in terms of kind of this spectrum of like bad to good to very close to ESL learner or not. Because I think after this exercise, I think what I've convinced myself is that, well, people actually do learn very differently. So I think it might help us see a bigger difference between MT systems, but I might not be able to see that, oh, the high performing one is somewhat more close to key.
Okay.
I think that's kind of the differentiation.
So we would be very happy, of course, to help you do that because
Yeah.
we are like that.
Yeah, great. Okay, so now I'm going to change direction a little bit and talk about something called redundant phrase detection. And for this one, we're going to try to use MT to help us solve this purely monolingual problem. So the problem is this, and many of you, even if you're native speakers, must have experienced it, where you go take some English class, you write some essay, and then you get back this paper that's been marked by your teacher, and then you cross out all sorts of stuff, right? Because we tend to be, I think every writer tends to be somewhat wordy, and so a nice thing to be able to do in terms of making your writing more smooth is to be able to remove all these extra words that don't really convey any additional information and potentially actually might even adversely affect the way you're communicating because it makes it more awkward or it makes it more difficult to follow. So an example like this might be, this study asked the question of whether, whereas the question of is largely ignorable because you ask, so if you're asking, then you're asking a question. Or if you take any sort of bad writing from fan fiction sites, right, they'll say, her black ebony hair flows something, and well, either black or ebony, you choose one if you don't need it. So there are a lot of cases where people's writing has all of these extra words in them. And this is especially prevalent in non-native English learners. By an estimate, in this particular learner's corpus, a different one than the one that we talked about in the first half of the course, this is a corpus of Singaporean university level students called the Novel corpus. I'll reference it a couple times. So this corpus, largely used within the grammar error correction community, estimates that 13.71% of the errors are redundant extra words. And this is the second most frequent mistake, right behind preposition errors. So what we want to do is to be able to identify this automatically. The challenge here is that redundant phrases are kind of a subjective matter, and depending on who you ask, they might argue one way or another. So this is still fairly new work, and we're still trying to think about ways to formalize it better. But for now, for today's talk, what we're going to mostly trust is the judgment from this annotated corpus. We've looked through some of the sentences, and naturally, we have our own opinion about what might be considered redundant or might not be. But since this is an independently annotated corpus, we're going to just trust it for now. So let's take a look at how this relates to some of the other NLP-ish applications that you might have heard of. So this task is not directly related to kind of the standard grammar error correction, because some of these are not mistakes per se, as kind of more of a usage stylistic issue. So if you have something where it's not wrong to have it, maybe it's just nicer without, right? It's also not sentence compression in the sense that sentence compression is happy to cut off extraneous information that that may be considered true detail. Whereas for our task, if it's detailed but relevant, we wanted to keep it. So in this example, right, so the result of an intricate experiment, you can say, well, maybe intricate is irrelevant, or maybe even the experiment is irrelevant if you're summarizing and compressing. But if you're actually trying to communicate, then this is actually an important part of adequacy that we needed to convey. So the only thing that really we can eliminate using redundancy detection is ideally and uncertain, because uncertain and unpredictable are considered close enough to each other to be considered extra. And finally, it's also different from sentence simplification in the sense that sentence simplification tries to make it so that say a younger reader could understand a complicated sentence. Whereas for us, we don't actually care if it's hard to read, if you're using very SAT vocabularies, as long as it's concise. So there are a bunch of differences between what we're trying to do and what people have done before. Based on our literature search, we believe we are actually the first people to look at this specific problem. So in order to do so, we needed to come up with an automatic measure for estimating how redundant is a phrase. So the main idea behind what we're doing is we want to convert it to meaning something. So if either you don't have a whole lot of meaning, but you add to fluency, or you're important because you convey important meaning, you should be deleted if you add neither to fluency nor to meaning, especially. So for fluency, we can use our standard language model, but we need something to calculate meaning. And so since we work on MT, we think, well, MT, a different language model could approximation for meaning. So let's say, maybe we'll say, well, if you translate to another language, and if every word is important, then when you translate to this other language, every word should still be there. If you have a word that gets dropped off, well, either this word is not really important and it's just there for fluency for your own language, or maybe it's not important at all. So if you are not aligned at all, maybe you're not that important. If you're aligned a lot, then maybe this one English word contributes to 3 foreign language words, then maybe this is very important. And if you and another word are both aligned to something, then maybe one of you is extra with the language one. So to formalize, essentially, we say, well, suppose we have English sentence E, and we want to consider whether a substring ES T, that sentence is redundant. So let's say if we translate to some foreign language F, and then translate from foreign language F back to English, if the new English sentence looks basically like the old English sentence, but minus the ES through ET part, then maybe that phrase is highly redundant. So that's basically the calculation that we wanted to do. Though, for practical purposes, we can't actually calculate that. So we have to make approximations. So we don't consider all possible alignments, we don't consider all possible translation to all possible languages. We consider the most likely translation and its alignment. And we're even using just IBM Model 1 for figuring out the word alignment. Okay. And then so if we delete an English word, the one that's in boxes, then we potentially risk the cost of losing that alignment to the foreign language word that it's aligned with. So after doing some transformation, essentially this measure becomes this 2-term a three-term or one of those constants. This main two-term thing where one element is language model score and the second one is a per word meaning redundancy measure. It's essentially considering the number of words that it's aligned with and also the uniform probability of that word. As it turns out, rare words typically do convey more meaning, tend to be less redundant because you don't usually use it unless you have to. Okay? So for this experiment, we run the data set using this knuckle corpus, National University of Singapore corpus, learners corpus, where the redundancies are explicitly marked. We particularly look at just sentences where each sentence has exactly one redundant phrase of some length. And for this first task, we actually just spot the system, the length. So we'll tell the system, you are looking for a redundant phrase 3 words long. Run the measure, find what phrase has the highest redundancy score. Okay. And the tools that we use include using a trigram model trained on GigaWord, and we will translate specifically using French as our pivot, which gave the best results. We've tried a bunch of them, so if you're interested, I can show you the comparison graph later. So this is how they measured up. The scores are all very low. This is a difficult problem. If you randomly choose, you're going to do badly. That's obvious. Trigram, if you just purely consider language model scores alone, you can actually do okay, right? 8% compared to all of the other choices individually. We've tried the sentence compression scores. We've tried doing standard round trip translation to see how many words disappeared after the round trip translation. And all of the scores are kind of in the tens, even in combination with trigram. So the interesting thing about this is that the way that we compose the metric, combining trigram with the proposed individual word redundancy measure, we actually do see a sum is greater than its parts case. This is actually for me very rare in NLP. Usually you sum up the parts that do well and then you get something that's a little bit less, which is usually the case in, for example, round trip and 6 score. So that's kind of where we were. Since then, I'll just say a few words. Wei Chao, who's the student who worked on this, has defended his dissertation and graduated, and so he did a little bit more work since then about this, where he included this measure as well as everything else as additional features and trained a classifier to specifically predict whether a word should be deleted or not. And he also did some work in trying to make sure that the corpus itself is a little bit more believable. So we took the knuckle corpus and we essentially asked 5 mechanical Turkers per sentence to judge whether they can find a word that's redundant or not. And if the majority of them agree, then we say, okay, well, this one has been certified by knuckle as well as 4 or so mechanical Turkers, then we'll consider that sentence to definitely contain something that's redundant. And doing so, including improving the corpus quality and improving all of the indicator features, we are now at about 37%, and I'm hoping to improve it further as time goes on. But that's kind of where we are now. I'm pretty interested in this problem because it's hard to define exactly what redundancy means. So I think one of the first things we want to do is to just kind of clarify what we mean by redundancy and differentiate it from other sorts of things that you might want to delete words from. And then find better ways to kind of capture what people are thinking of when they say, well, this word seems redundant. So these are kind of the things that are interesting to me right now. All of them have kind of this flavor of trying to leverage what we have learned from MT, because MT has been very successful technology for some time, and so it should be applicable not just to MT, but to lots of other problems. And we also would like to, in the end, still try to improve MT And so these are kind of the things that we've been looking at. Also interested in, very related to the error correction detection problem, this idea of modeling writing revisions. So every student who has to write has been told the only way you write better is through lots of multiple revisions. And so it would be interesting to be able to model that process in some way. What sort of errors do you correct? This doesn't have to be necessarily grammar error. It could be stylistic error. It could be even semantic errors. It could be even on higher discourse level to think, well, so instead of putting sentence 1 here, sentence 2 there, I actually want the order swap because that would make my argument stronger. And so these are kind of things that I think are interesting to consider in the future. One thing I also am interested in but haven't talked about today is purely just trying to model non-native English writers as a source language and try to translate directly between. We've done some initial work on that, but I'm interested in kind of coming back to that a little bit more. And you can see that as kind of in correlations with the writing language use. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say today to you guys. I'd be happy to answer questions.
This last person will be presented trigram. Not sure exactly what's exactly not okay there.
Yeah.
But the longer, there's probably more information here. Longer n-grams, training on a lot more data, looking at the back-off behavior of that language model.
Yeah.
Things like that might be.
That might. So mostly what we're doing right now is consider what the sentence would look like without that particular word embedded. So instead of saying, say if you have A, B, C, D, then it's basically looking at the trigram of A, B, D, and then B, D, whatever, and going forward. And sure, certainly longer would be better. I think the trigram was just our first approximation. I actually suspect that that might not, I mean, using longer n-gram probably will help us a little bit. But I think probably what we want is a better sense of synonyms. So I think actually throwing in something like a pairwise wordnet check might be a reasonable thing to do, for example. And there might be also just phrases that people constantly use as fillers, however, firstlies. These are kind of like common things that kind of language tips and things that I might be able to just get a little bit of better.
What about very consistent patterns in English that, I don't know if this kind of floats up as redundancy in English or not, but like the ability in English to do something as a compound noun or possessive versus a phrase attachment, like, the student's book versus the book of the student.
Right.
So is often book of the student redundant because there's another way?
No. So that's considered okay. I mean, we're truly looking for, I mean, that would be a hard case to have, right? So if you have a very complex prepositional phrase, an English teacher would say, you got to rewrite this because this is bad. But we're not currently addressing the harder problem of rewriting. We're just editing, we're just marking out. So the harder problem would be we mark out and also are allowed to do word form changes. So say in the example from critical reception into critique, that would be a substitution change. That would be a little bit harder than the current. Okay. All right. Yes.
So the one data type that probably would get would be people, translators who are correcting machine translations.
Right.
Why not make use of that?
I
might be able to get, I mean, I know that they exist. Obviously,
Right.
people use that.
Right.
Part of, you have to work with these translation associations.
Or with the company.
Or whatever, yeah. But I mean, that would be really interesting.
That'd be really great, yeah. Because that's kind of the issue that we have, is that we don't have very reliable definition of what redundant means. So
Not just for redundant, for the whole.
oh,
for
the whole thing, yes. So there's that. There's also the various writing centers, writing clinics that have student writings that kids write.
Right, I mean, you could be evaluating complete translations.
Oh, you're on the first half. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
And that would be very consistent.
That's right.
You could look at evaluations, find local formation.
Right. Now, one challenge there is that we still have to come up with a reasonable schema of correction types. And that, to me, is actually non-trivial. Right? So, like, we can have a translation sentence and a human corrected version of the same, but then, like, to say, well, this error is because of this.
I thought you were going to get away with that by being more specific.
So by being more specific, you still need to say what the specific cases are. And in fact, that actually to me is currently the big issue, because what we did was we just said, well, we're going to trust the ESL people. So whatever the ESL people said are common cases, we're going to map them. But for MT purposes, sometimes the error is different, and it's not necessarily a grammatical error, but it might be a suitability of the word choice, in which case maybe there's a finer grained category that a human would never make that kind of mistake, but an MT would. And so then we would have to decide, okay, so when the translator changed it from word A to word B, what is the rationale behind it? So we need to come up with that taxonomy rationale. That would be an interesting question. Yes?
I'm not sure my English is the second language.
Yes.
So, for the pronunciations, there are different types of English, right? American, British, Australian, and so on. You just observe the same thing in English, that there are actually different styles or guidelines for British English and British English.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. So
Could you repeat the question?
the question is whether there would be differences if I were studying instead of American English, but say British English or Australian English, whether what would be considered redundant here would be considered not so redundant there. And that is a possibility. I mean, that is entirely possible. Because I think everybody here, growing up here, going through high school here, you were taught to write in a certain way. And I certainly, from some of my British colleagues, their usage is a little bit different, and I'd be like, isn't this very wordy? Isn't this very weird? No, this is appropriate. So I think there is some stylistic, but for the purpose of our study, our students are way below that level of proficiency. So I think you're talking about a very nuanced definition of redundant versus not. Whereas we're looking more like gross redundancy that most people would probably agree that should be legal.
But you used the Cambridge model, right? So that's British English, or is that Cambridge English?
No, that was actually the British Cambridge. Yes, I don't know. I think again there the proficiency level is not high enough to have that level of differentiation. Although to kind of further address your point, so for the redundancy study we used a different corpus than the Cambridge one, but we did compare them. And in terms of finding unnecessary words, in this corpus it's tagged as the second most likely mistake that a Singaporean student makes. But in the Cambridge corpus it happens a lot, but it's not on the second. So there, I don't know if it's due to annotator style guide difference or whether it's national English difference. Yeah.
And in this respect, that's not error types. We said word that an error fluent verb that is handling instead of the building. So in that that's actually right twice.
Yeah.
Right.
So those changes would not trigger any sort of error.